Pokémon, Pokémon, Pokémon! Yeah, if you know anything about media, you are definitely bound to hear about Pokémon. Starting in 1996, the series grew in popularity thanks to various things like the Pokémon TV show, trading cards, and the mass amount of merch over the years. Which pretty much turned what was once a small little Game Boy title into literally the biggest media franchise of all time period. Where for every single Nintendo handheld device, Pokémon comes to follow being the biggest money seller for that console. We're currently 9 generations of Pokémon, with the 10th gen most likely coming next year or the other. So I really want to make videos on the mainline Pokémon games since these are a very big part of Nintendo's history. So I think it's best to start with the Kanto region of Pokémon since it's the very first entry in the series. Now my personal history is that I was mostly a Gen 4 kid back in the day, so I don't really have a strong nostalgia for the earlier games, compared to something like Black and White and especially X and Y, which was when my Pokémon fever was the strongest at the time, especially with my cousins. I still even have this cool little scrapbook full of Pokémon cards that I collected over the years. Oh god, how long ago did I get that? Oh god, 2008, that was literally 16 years ago. At least I still have the cool little Detective Pikachu cards that I got during the theaters when the movie came out, which was 5 years ago. Okay. Now with Gen 1, there were so many versions of this one out there. The first two released in 1996, which was Pokémon Red and Blue. They're essentially the same games, but the main difference is that there are Pokémon that are exclusive to each version. The only way to get each exclusive Pokémon is to trade them via the link cable. And then next year in the United States, Pokémon Yellow then released, and this one's a bit more unique because it takes a lot of inspirations of the Pokémon anime, such as having a Pikachu companion alongside with you as your starter, and Jessie and James appearing in this game. And then years later on the GBA, Nintendo and Game Freak then remade Pokémon Red and Blue, called Pokémon Fire Red and Leaf Green. And the only reason why they replaced Blue with Green because in Japan there was never a Pokémon Blue version, instead it was Green version. And this is going to be the version I'm going to be focusing on in the video since I think this is probably the best way to play the original Kanto version. And besides some tweaks here and here with the balancing and difficulty, this game is essentially the same game as the original except it looks nicer. Can't really say about it for the hardcore Pokemon fans because I'm more casual. Unlike the other Kanto remake, they're released all the way to 2018 for the Nintendo Switch, which is entitled Pokemon Let's Go Pikachu and Eevee, which is pretty much a remake of the Pokemon Yellow version, where you have a Pikachu companion, but this time you can also have an Eevee companion. However, this game is very different from the other ones, because while Pokemon Fire Red and Leaf Green is pretty much a pitch-by-pitch remake, Pokemon Let's Go is a way more simplified version of Kanto, especially with the wild Pokemon encounters, because unlike doing an actual turn-based RPG battle, it pretty much became the little catching minigame to capitalize on Pokemon Go. They even added this cute little Pokeball controller that pretty much locks Mew behind a paywall. And this is the only way you can get Mew in the game, so I hope you can pay a good fortune online. Never change, Game Freak. Just kidding, please change. So yeah, I'd say Pokemon Fire Red and Leaf Green are better remakes, and overall makes the experience better for the original Gen 1 game. So with everything out of the way, let's get started. When you start the game, you are greeted with Professor Oak, who introduces you to the world of Pokemon alongside with choosing your avatar's name and your rival's name, which so happens to be the professor's grandson, but for some reason he has to think of what his name is. Now, canonically, your avatar's name is Red, while your rival name is Blue. I just put my own name in, and as for Blue, well, I just named him Gary because I feel like a lot of people would name him Gary thanks to the anime. Don't lie to yourself, I know you're probably going to call him Gary once in your life. But anyway, so these two live in a small town called Pallet Town, who's ready to become Pokemon trainers, so they can go across these tall grass because apparently it's too dangerous to even walk in grass because Pokemon might snatch out at them. Because when you try to leave the town, the professor then shows up to warn him it's too dangerous, and so they come into the lab to get a Pokemon. In the location, you have 3 Pokemon to choose from in the Pokeballs, which are Charmander, Squirtle, and Bulbasaur, who each are a different type of Pokemon. But yeah, so basically, you get a Pokemon and try to journey out through the different areas of Kanto, by competing in these special gyms where, if you get all 8 of them, you can compete in the Pokemon League and become the champion. Now with Pokemon Gen 1, the story for this game is pretty light for the most part, with the only big conflict besides Gary is to deal with a criminal organization called Team Rocket who are trying to steal or kill Pokemon to take over the world. But despite that, they aren't really a priority on your list. You're so happen to exploring various talents and so happen to stumble upon them. But I don't really mind it too much because this is still the very first entry of the series. And while it does lack a bit of story for an RPG, it does make up for it for having really fun gameplay. But anyways, so since this is a turn-based RPG, that means the gameplay is divided into two sections, which is the explorative nature of the overworld and the battle system for Pokemon. Kanto has a decent amount of variety of things to explore in each of the areas. Whether exploring the grassy plains of the roots, going through different forces to capture Pokemon, or trying to figure out a way to get through these caves because it feels like a freaking maze, it's never really boring to explore the region. Especially with all the trainers throughout the region, because every time they'll see you, they'll ask you to do a Pokemon battle. It happens so frequently, it actually becomes a bit of an obstacle course to see how much you can avoid these people. But you're probably going to do them anyway because this is an RPG and such. Now, while you explore the areas of Kanto, your main goal throughout is trying to get the gym leader. Now, the structure of this game is fairly linear, except for maybe the later part of the game where it gets a bit open, where you get to choose which gym you want to go first. But I don't really mind that because it makes everything feel a lot more streamlined. The only thing I'm not really too keen on are probably the environments, but I can't really blame the game too much because this is still the first ever Pokemon gen. But I don't know, some of the cities just kind of blend in together for me, where they just structure it like a Pokemon Center marked in buildings. For at least the first few ones, because with the later ones, they do get a lot more memorable, and I really do like the later ones, like Saffron City, for example, where the main thing is exploring this giant building and make sure you can take down Team Rocket inside the place. Cinnabar Island is a cool little town that's located on top of an island, which you can explore this abandoned mansion full of ghosts and Pokemon rats. Keldon City is the biggest area of the game where you explore these giant buildings that has a good shopping center, and also introduce compulsive gambling to Nintendo fans before Super Mario 64 DS. And this addiction will also lead you to Team Rocket's hideout to take them out. Again. And last, and probably one of my favorite ones, is Lavender Town. As the tone for this one is very unique compared to the other ones, where instead of it being upbeat and happy, the tone this time is a lot more eerie and somber-like. As this place is the location of the Pokemon Tower, which is a gravesite for all the Pokemon who died, with some of the trainers inside mourning the loss of their favorite partner. And the deeper you explore into it, the trainers you'll be fighting along the way are freaking possessed by ghosts! But if you want a location that's less haunted, you could always go to the Orange Islands, which are these tropical islands that you can explore. Or you can also go to the Safari Zone, which is a good place to capture Pokemon, where instead of using a traditional battle system, you have to use various other things like bait or just throwing a rock at them to capture them. Which is the perfect enough time to talk about the secondary gameplay style for Pokemon, which is the turn-based RPG aspect. So in Pokemon, your RPG party is the Pokemon you find along the way. You first start off with one Pokemon, which so happens to be the 3 stars I mentioned earlier, and in order to get more Pokemon, you need to battle them. If the Pokemon's health is empty, that means they'll faint, meaning that you'll get experience points, but if you want to capture them, you need to make sure that he has low health, because the lower the health is, the more likely you'll be able to get the Pokemon. I mean, you can technically capture a Pokemon in full health, but the chances of actually doing it are very slim. I only was able to do it once with my Abra. If I only have one good tip of what kind of Pokemon you should capture, is that since you have only 6 Pokemon in your inventory, it's best to have each of them be a unique type. Because for every single type of Pokemon, they're either good against another type, or very weak against another one. That's why with the starters they choose a fire type, a grass type, and a water type because they work in a rock, paper, scissors. The only true type that is probably very difficult to go against is probably the psychic type, which is why it's best to try and find one yourself because psychic types is very powerful and they don't really have a lot of weaknesses. Or at least the Kanto games because they resolve this in later entries. Which leads to us to the trainer battles because unlike the wild Pokemon battles where you only have one Pokemon to deal with trainer battles, you have to deal with probably multiple ones at the same time. Especially during the gym leaders, because with these you have to navigate your way away from the trainers because they pretty much try to tire out your Pokemon before the big gym leader comes in. And as for the gym leaders themselves, they honestly put up a really good challenge for the most part. It's a good thing I start with Squirtle because with Brock his main thing is rock type Pokemon, so Squirtle has a really good advantage. And as for the other ones, they all bring up a pretty good challenge, although for something like Sabrina, she really put me onto a ringer. Mostly because she was the Psychic type gym leader, meaning that she's probably the most difficult because I mentioned earlier, Psychic types are the most powerful ones. So basically I grinded a good amount, although at the cost I kinda went a bit too carried away because with the later ones, I kinda made them a bit easier. Especially the final gym leader, Giovanni, who is the leader of Team Rocket. And this final battle was so humiliating to him, he decides to disband Team Rocket permanently. The entire criminal organization collapsed thanks to a 10-year-old. So yeah, leveling up is pretty much a big importance of training your Pokemon. As the more powerful the Pokemon gets, the more moves they are able to perform. However, the Pokemon are limited to only 4 moves, so it's best to choose wisely on which moves to keep or try to replace. And also, if you're able to evolve them enough, they're able to turn into a much more powerful form. Like with Squirtle, where he starts off as this cute little turtle, and his final form, he turns into this giant tortoise with cannons on his shell. But leveling up isn't the only way to evolve a Pokemon, because there are other Pokemons in this game that evolve in different criterias. Like Kadabra can only evolve into Alakazam if you have a special link cable for your Game Boy, which is used to trade Pokemon with other players and such and do a little multiplayer, but since I'm using an emulator, I cannot evolve Kadabra. But the final way to evolve Pokemon in Kanto is with the Evolution Stones. There are different types of Evolution Stones that are compatible with different types of Pokemon. Like a Pikachu who needs a Thunderstone to evolve because he's an Electric type. And I think the best example for the Evolution Stones has to be for Eevee. The Pokemon, I guarantee you, if Pikachu didn't exist, this would have been the big mascot for Pokemon. But anyway, so Eevee is known as the evolution Pokemon because out of every single one, Eevee has to have the most evolutions. But starting with Kanto, he only has 3 evolutions that go inside with the 3 evolution stones. You can even use these special TMs that are able to have Pokemon learn certain moves without leveling up. Unfortunately, while it's a cool concept, I just have one big issue with this game because there are certain TMs that are required to progress through the game. Because there are certain things that'll probably block your progress, and the only way to do it is have Pokemon do a certain move, like Cut for example. And another criticism I do have of the game is probably how the cave system are laid out. Because usually when you encounter wild Pokemon, it's usually in the tall grass. But when you go into the caves, the way you encounter Pokemon is that they spawn literally every 5 seconds. And it does get annoying when you run out of Repel, which is supposed to help you get away from Pokemon. Especially if you're doing a backtrack, meaning that you already know the layout and such, and you just have to encounter these wild Pokemon. At least the music for the caves are really cool, which honestly brings me to the presentation of this game. With the original Game Boy game, I do have a lot of respect for it because it did start a good foundation, but the one on GBA just looks amazing. I really love the pixel art style for this game. The colors and everything in this remake honestly really pops so well. And while I do like the 3D graphics of Pokemon Let's Go Pikachu, I don't know, there's just something very lively about the pixel art style for the GBA game. And the music for this game is also really good. I really love the main theme song because it's very iconic, especially with that cool battle theme. And the music can also feel very triumphant, especially when you travel through Victory Road. Now before we wrap things up, I think it's time to talk about the endpoint in the game. So once you collect all 8 badges, you are able to be qualified for the Pokemon League, where after you traverse through a small cave area, you find yourself in a little gauntlet area called the Elite Four. And the Pokemon League are no joke because these guys are really, really hard. So it's best to keep Pokemon on a high level as well as try to strategize which kind of Pokemon you should bring along your way, because you need to go through the entirety of going against these trainers at once. And this all leads to the final battle with you and Gary, as he just became the Pokemon champion and he's not going to let anyone get in his way. The final battle with Gary was long and grueling, and it was honestly worth it at the end because he put up one hell of a challenge. And I couldn't think of a better way to conclude this Pokemon journey. And honestly, it was one heck of a journey. I really adore playing through Pokemon Kanto. I was never really that nostalgic for this generation because, as I mentioned earlier, I grew up with the later games, but honestly, I do get the appeal for this one in particular. Even though this is probably the most basic Pokemon game since it is the first entry, but I don't really mind that because the gameplay loop for Pokemon is just so fun to go through. And sometimes simplicity has great appeal. Plus, after you become the Pokemon champion, there's also other things you can do throughout the game, like finding special legendary Pokemons. You can complete the Pokédex so you can get special rewards and such, or you can traverse through the Orange Islands. Although I wish this game was a bit more accessible for a lot of people, because with the Nintendo Switch they do have the NSO apps and such, but for some reason Pokemon never got a entry on them. And while we do have Pokemon Let's Go Pikachu and Eevee, the direction for those games are way different from a traditional Pokemon game, where they lean more towards a casual audience. But regardless, I think Kanto is still a really good time, and I recommend trying it out. And we're just only starting our Pokemon journey, because the next time we ever go to the Pokemon series, we're going to go straight to Johto. But for now, we're going to jump from the world of Pokemon to the world of Spyro for our next video. So that'll do for today, and thank you for watching, and I'll see you later. Bye bye!